Well, good morning. It is Saturday, May 29th. Right, yeah. And we are here for a morning devotion from N.T. Wright's Hebrews for Everyone. And today's passage is Hebrews 8, verses 1 through 6. The point of all this now appears. We have just such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the heavenly Master. As the minister of the holy things and of the true tabernacle, the one made by God rather than by humans. Every high priest, you see, is appointed in order to offer gifts and sacrifices, which is why this too must have something to offer. If he were on earth, he wouldn't even be a priest, since there are already priests who make offering in accordance to the law. They serve a copy of the shadow of the heavenly realities in line with what Moses was told when he was getting ready to construct the tabernacle. Take care that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain. Now you see, Jesus has obtained a vastly superior ministry. In the same way, he is the mediator of a better covenant, which is established on better promises. When my sons were little, we gave them a game they could play at home. It was a type of football or soccer, except that they played it on a tabletop with plastic figures an inch or two high. You had to flick them with your fingers so that you could hit the ball and try to get it to your opponent's goal in the usual way. It's not a bad game as far as it goes. You can become quite good at it, particularly if you're small and have active little fingers that learn how to flick the players in exactly the right way. But if you've ever seen an actual football match, you would never mistake the tabletop version for the real thing. Supposing, however, that the game was given to a family that had never really seen a real football game, but who didn't know that such a thing existed, they might imagine that the tabletop football was the reality that was there. They wouldn't know that if it was a copy of the real thing and gained most of its meaning and its appeal for the most people because it remained them of the true grown-up version. Something like this, only more so, lies at the heart of the contrast Hebrews now draws, and will go on to draw between the temple in Jerusalem and or the tabernacle, which the Israelites had during their wilderness journey, and a true or real shrine, which is heaven. But this, like some other things in the letter, is difficult for us to grasp, and we need to pause and approach it slowly. The trouble is that as soon as we hear someone talking about something in the present world becoming related to something in heaven, we are inclined to imagine the sort of contrast between the Greek philosopher Plato, who thought that everything in the world of space, time, and material object was a copy, and a rather second-rate one at that, of things in the ideal world, thing which he called forms. Lots of readers have imagined that Hebrews wants us to think in that way too, about the earthly and heavenly realities. But the meaning of heaven and earth in the Bible, not least in this book, is quite different from what Plato had in mind. For a start, we have already learned that Jesus has gone, still a fully human being, into the world of heaven, something Plato could never have allowed. Heaven is not in the Bible, simply a spiritual, in the sense of a non-physical dimension in God's space, God's realm, which interlocks with our realm, our world, earth, in all sorts of ways. And just to make things one step more complicated again, the Israelites believed that the temple in Jerusalem was a place above all where heaven and earth meant quite literally. When you went into the temple, especially when you went into the Holy of Holies in the middle of it, you were actually going into heaven itself. So when Hebrews talks about the temple or the wilderness tabernacle as a copy or shadow of the heavenly realities, the writer is careful to explain what it means. The original tabernacle, which accompanied the Israelites in the wilderness and continued as the center of Israelite worship until the temple was built by Solomon, was constructed according to Exodus 25 through 31, on the basis of detailed instructions given by God himself to Moses. Indeed, according to the passage quoted here in verse 5, God actually showed Moses the heavenly sanctuary when he was on Mount Sinai. He let him look through the flimsy curtain that separated God's space and our space so that Moses could see the true reality and be sure that the earthly copy made it in the right way. Then later in the letter, we discover that this heavenly reality is part of the heavenly Jerusalem, to which all Jesus followers already belong. All this is mysterious, indeed mind-boggling. But if we are to follow that thinking of the early Christians, we must be patient. This passage, in fact, draws together for the first time the contrast between Jesus as the high priest and all the priests that have gone before him. It's placed this contrast inside two larger contrasts. The contrast of the heavenly and the temporal, or the temple and tabernacle, and the true heavenly one. And the contrast between the old covenant, the bond established on Mount Sinai between God and Israel, and the new covenant, promised long ago and now brought together in Jesus. Verse 6 mentions this latter point, introduces the new section of the letter, which begins in verse 7. The thrust of this conclusion, then, is that the reader must learn to distinguish between the copy and the reality. Like small children discovering that there is such a thing as real live football, for which their tabletop game is just a small substitute. That they must learn to celebrate and enjoy the real thing and not cling to the copy. This must have presented a particular challenge to those early Christians who all their lives had looked at the temple in Jerusalem as the focus of devotion, the place of pilgrimage, the very house of God, and the priests who served in the temple as God's representative for all time. The challenge must have appeared as much political as theological. For much of the first century, the Jews who lived in and around Jerusalem received themselves as being under threat, not least from Rome. Eventually, that threat would burst out into an open war, which would end with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. In such circumstances, anyone suggesting that the temple was only a copy of the reality, and that anyone who came to God through Jesus was entering the true temple, which had long existed in heaven and would one day be revealed to the reality, would be seen as a horribly disobedient. And when countries and cultures were under threat, disloyalty is something punishable with violence. As we shall see in chapter 10, that was indeed what had happened. Part of the reason for writing the letter may have been that the Jewish Christians who received it were under exactly that kind of pressure and threat, and needed to know very clearly that the Jesus who they were following was indeed the true high priest, and had indeed entered the true temple on their behalf. The old temple was good. The new, real one was better. The old priests were gone, the new priest was better. The old covenant was gone, the new one was better and established on better promises. As we look back to those early days and put ourselves in the shoes of the heart and the forebears of Christian faith, we do well to ask ourselves whether our own devotion to Jesus, our own celebration of all that he is and has done, is as powerful, as central to our lives as the writer wanted to be for his readers. If he were better than the temple and its priesthood, how much more better is he the many things which was easily distract us from a single-minded devotion to him. So a copy. So he uses that analogy of a soccer table being a copy of the real game. And I understand that. So our church, he's saying, is a copy of what heaven may look like. Not physically, actually, but figuratively what it may look like. And not to worship and be obedient to that copy, but we worship and be obedient to the actual being of the temple, which in this case he's telling the Christians, the early Christians, that is Jesus. And he writes it in such a way that those Christians were probably struggling with, how come we can't go to temple? Why can't we go to the temple anymore? We can't sacrifice anymore. So they were trying to figure out what that was all about. So the writer is saying, you don't need to go to temple anymore. That's just a copy of what heaven and what God looks like. We have the true God in Jesus. He died for us. He rose for us. This is where we worship. This is who we worship. Not the building, but in Jesus. And I think we've learned well over this past year that the building becomes insignificant. We have other ways to worship. This video camera. This is how we have worshiped for a while. And we learned that that's okay. The building became less important for us as much as our worship. And that's all he's saying in this passage. Don't worship the building. Don't worship what happens in the building. Worship God while you're in that building. But worship God when you're away from that building as well.